In 1433, the most powerful technology company in the world made a decision that would destroy it. And 6 centuries later, Sundar Pichai is making the exact same choice. The Ming Dynasty had the best engineers, the largest market share, and infrastructure their competitors couldn't dream of matching. And they decided to burn it all down, not because they were failing, but because they were winning too much. The Ming Dynasty didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it was dominant. And if you understand what happened in the Forbidden City 600 years ago, you'll understand exactly what's happening inside Google's headquarters in Mountain View right now. Most people get this wrong about empires, whether technological or political. They assume decline comes from external threats, from hungrier competitors, from disruptive innovation they couldn't see coming. The Ming Dynasty could see everything. They possessed the most advanced navy on Earth, diplomatic relationships spanning from Japan to East Africa, gunpowder, paper currency, and a civil service examination system that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 3 centuries. And they chose to stop, not because they had to, but because they decided winning wasn't worth the complexity anymore. That decision, the decision to prioritize control over capability, is exactly what Clayton Christensen warned about in The Innovator's Dilemma. It's the most expensive mistake an organization can make, and Google is making it right now. Between 1405 and 1433, a Chinese admiral named Zheng He commanded what historians call the treasure fleet. These weren't ordinary ships. The largest vessels, called Bao Chuan, stretched over 400 feet long, and for comparison, Columbus's Santa Maria measured about 60 feet. Zheng He's flagship could have carried Columbus's entire fleet on its deck. 7 voyages across the Indian Ocean brought the treasure fleet to Malacca, Ceylon, the Persian Gulf, and the Horn of Africa. Trade relationships formed, tribute flowed in, and coastlines got mapped that European sailors wouldn't see for another century. At its peak, the fleet numbered over 300 ships and nearly 30,000 men, making it the most sophisticated naval operation the world had ever seen. And then Emperor Xuande decided it was too expensive. Not financially expensive, because the voyages turned a profit. The expense was diplomatic and bureaucratic. Every voyage meant new relationships to manage, new trade disputes to arbitrate, new information flowing into a system that preferred stability over growth. The Confucian scholar officials at court argued that the voyages encouraged dangerous ideas like foreign influence, commercial thinking, and innovation for its own sake, rather than in service of the established order. What happened next went beyond ending the voyages. They destroyed the records. They dismantled the shipyards. Building ocean-going vessels with more than 2 masts became illegal. The Haijin policy, the sea ban, didn't just pause exploration. It criminalized the capability to explore. Within a generation, the most advanced naval technology in human history had vanished. The maps burned. The engineering knowledge died with the shipbuilders who weren't allowed to teach it. And when Portuguese traders arrived in Chinese waters a century later, they found a coastline that had forgotten it once ruled the seas. The Portuguese didn't have better ships than Zheng He. They just kept sailing while China burned its maps. By 1498, Vasco da Gama had reached India. By 1511, the Portuguese had seized Malacca, the same port Zheng He had visited peacefully decades earlier. The power vacuum created by the Haijin policy wasn't filled by superior technology but by sustained will. The connection between 15th-century Chinese maritime policy and a search engine company in California might not be obvious, but it runs deep. The Ming Dynasty's mistake wasn't building the Great Wall. It wasn't the treasure fleet voyages. It wasn't even the Haijin policy itself. The mistake was a specific failure mode that shows up in every dominant organization eventually, where they optimize for protecting what they have instead of building what comes next. Imperial China had the examination system, the Keiju, which selected bureaucrats based on their mastery of classical texts. Google has a promotion system that selects leaders based on their mastery of existing products. Both cases produce the same result, where the people who rise to power are the ones who understand how things currently work, not the ones who imagine how things could work differently. The Forbidden City housed Confucian scholar officials who viewed commerce as vulgar and exploration as destabilizing. Mountain View houses advertising revenue guardians who view any product that doesn't serve the search and ads flywheel as a distraction. Google's advertising revenue hit $237 billion in 2023. That's not a business model but a gravity well, and every strategic decision bends toward that mass. The mechanism is identical, and only the robes are different. The Ming court didn't fear exploration because it might fail. They feared it because it might succeed. Success meant change, new trade routes meant new power centers, and new knowledge meant new questions. For an organization built on the premise that it already had all the answers, questions became threats. Google doesn't fear AI because it might fail. They fear it because it might succeed in ways that obsolete search. Every query answered by a chatbot is a query that doesn't see ads. Every task completed by an agent is a task that doesn't require 10 blue links. The better AI gets, the more it threatens the thing that made Google dominant. And that's when you see the same response the Ming court had. They don't abandon the new technology, because that would be obviously foolish. They capture it. They bureaucratize it. They make sure it serves the existing power structure rather than threatening it. Gemini isn't designed to be the best AI. Gemini is designed to be the AI that protects search. Google has the ships because the underlying architecture of Gemini is genuinely world-class, but they're choosing not to sail them. That distinction matters. When your innovation strategy becomes making sure the new thing doesn't disrupt the old thing, you've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Meanwhile, Satya Nadella's partnership with OpenAI wasn't just a business deal. He was launching ships while Google built walls. 3 specific principles drove the Ming collapse, and Google is repeating each one. The first principle is what historians call defensive consolidation. After the treasure fleet voyages ended, the Ming court didn't just stop expanding. They started building walls, literally. The Great Wall, as tourists visit it today, that stone fortification spanning the mountains, was primarily a Ming construction. Earlier dynasties had built earthwork barriers, but the Ming turned wall building into a national obsession. Walls reveal something counterintuitive about power. They're not signs of strength, but signs of fear. A confident empire doesn't need walls because it projects power outward and shapes its environment rather than hiding from it. Walls represent a decision to stop shaping and start reacting, to define your territory and then defend it rather than continuing to expand what's possible. Google's wall is regulatory capture. Over the past decade, they've invested more in lobbying, legal strategy, and compliance infrastructure than any technology company in history. They've hired former regulators and shaped privacy frameworks like GDPR to create moats that favor incumbents. The defensive perimeter they've built isn't made of technology, but of bureaucratic complexity. Competing with Google in advertising doesn't just require better algorithms, but a legal team that can navigate a regulatory environment Google helped design. What's darkly impressive is that Google's regulatory strategy is actually optimal game theory for a 5-year time horizon. Every dollar spent on lobbying generates predictable returns in reduced competition and favorable policy. The problem is that 5-year optimization in a 50-year industry is how you become a case study. The expected value math looks brilliant until you realize you've traded long-term capability for short-term defensibility. Every resource spent on walls is a resource not spent on ships. Every engineer working on compliance is an engineer not working on whatever comes next. The Ming court thought they could wall themselves into permanent stability, but instead they walled themselves into irrelevance. When the Manchu armies finally came in 1644, they didn't breach the Great Wall through superior force. The Manchus brought 120,000 soldiers while the Ming had over 1 million. But numbers meant nothing because the system had forgotten how to fight. A Ming general named Wu Sangui opened the gates for them because the internal rot had become so thorough that collaboration with invaders seemed preferable to continued loyalty. The second principle is knowledge destruction through bureaucratic capture. Those treasure fleet records I mentioned earlier have an official story that they were destroyed by a court official named Lu Daxia who feared they might encourage future expeditions. The deeper truth runs more interesting. The knowledge wasn't destroyed in a moment of vandalism but through decades of neglect enabled by bureaucratic hostility. Shipbuilding techniques required master craftsmen who trained apprentices over decades. Navigation charts required scholars who maintained them, copied them, and updated them with new information. Diplomatic relationships required officials who spoke foreign languages and understood foreign customs. None of this knowledge could survive without institutional support, and once the court decided exploration was politically inconvenient, that support evaporated. No one had to burn the maps, they just had to stop paying the people who understood them. Google's version of this is what former employees call the reorg death spiral. Promising projects get moved between divisions, while teams get split up and institutional knowledge fragments across organizational boundaries. Biologists have a term for what happens when a species over-optimizes for current conditions, and they call it an evolutionary dead end. Google has created an organizational equivalent, a product ecosystem that experiences regular mass extinctions, except these aren't caused by asteroids but by quarterly earnings calls. The graveyard tells the story. Google Reader died in 2013 despite millions of devoted users. Inbox by Gmail got shuttered in 2019 just as it was perfecting email. Stadia was abandoned in 2023 after Google had convinced developers to build for the platform. The list stretches for pages. Each cancellation looks reasonable in isolation. This product doesn't have enough users. That product doesn't fit the strategic direction. The other product competes with a higher priority initiative. The cumulative effect is that Google has trained its best people to never invest emotionally in anything that isn't search or ads. Pouring your creativity into a new product makes no sense when you've watched the last 15 new products get abandoned. DeepMind, Google's crown jewel AI research lab, has seen its best researchers leave for competitors, not because Google couldn't pay them, but because the bureaucracy made innovation feel pointless. Demis Hassabis built one of the most sophisticated AI organizations in the world, and Google has spent years figuring out how to make it serve the advertising machine rather than letting it run. The knowledge isn't destroyed through malice, but through a system that values predictable revenue over experimental capability. And just like the Ming court, no single decision seems catastrophic. It's only in aggregate that you realize they've burned the maps. The third principle is what I call the coherence trap, which is the subtlest failure mode, and the one that kills you. The Ming examination system was a remarkable achievement. For centuries, it provided China with a professional bureaucracy selected on merit rather than birth. Candidates studied for years to master the Confucian classics, the histories, and the proper forms of poetry and essay writing. The system produced administrators who were learned, literate, and aligned on values. That alignment was precisely the problem. When everyone in leadership has been selected for their mastery of the same texts, their agreement on the same principles, and their fluency in the same style of thinking, you get extraordinary coherence. Coherence is the enemy of adaptation. When the environment changes, you need people who think differently from each other, who bring outside perspectives, who haven't been optimized for the current system because they can imagine systems that don't yet exist. Network theorists call this catastrophic forgetting. When a system optimizes so heavily for one type of pattern that it loses the ability to recognize any other. The Ming court catastrophically forgot how to think like explorers. Every official who rose through the Keju had spent decades proving they could think like a Confucian scholar, and the system had no room for people who thought like admirals or merchants or cartographers. Google's coherence trap is the tyranny of data-driven decision-making. Every product decision, every feature launch, every strategic bet has to be justified with metrics, A, B, tests, user studies, and statistical significance. That sounds rigorous and scientific. And for incremental improvements to existing products, it is. Transformative innovation never wins an A/B test against the status quo. When you asked users in 2006 whether they wanted to watch videos on their phone, the data said no. When you asked users in 2009 whether they wanted a car with no steering wheel, the data said absolutely not. When you asked users in 2022 whether they wanted to talk to an AI instead of searching Google, the data said they preferred search. The data is coherent. The data reflects current preferences in current contexts. Optimizing for the data means optimizing for a world that's about to stop existing. Google has thousands of the smartest people on Earth, and they've built a system that ensures those people can only work on things the data already validates. It's the examination system all over again, selection for mastery of what currently works, which guarantees blindness to what could work next. Google is catastrophically forgetting how to think like founders. And this is where the story of Xerox PARC becomes haunting. Xerox invented the graphical user interface, the mouse, and the networked personal computer, then watched Apple and Microsoft commercialize all of it. The researchers at PARC could see the future while the executives at Xerox headquarters couldn't figure out how it fit their copier business. Google invented the transformer architecture that powers modern AI and published the paper called Attention is All You Need back in 2017. Now they're watching OpenAI and Anthropic commercialize it while they figure out how to make it fit their advertising business. History doesn't repeat, but the pattern echoes. Google's famous 20% time policy let engineers spend 1/5 of their work hours on personal projects. Gmail came from 20% time. Google News came from 20% time. It was structured exploration, the corporate equivalent of the treasure fleet voyages. And just like the hygiene policy, it's been quietly dismantled, not officially banned but bureaucratically discouraged, made incompatible with promotion criteria, and starved of the institutional support that made it work. No one had to cancel 20% time, they just had to stop paying attention to the people who used it. What the Ming Dynasty figured out, or rather what they failed to figure out until it was far too late, is the same thing Google is failing to figure out right now. Dominance creates its own blindness. The treasure fleet voyages weren't just about trade or diplomacy or national prestige. They were about maintaining the capability to be surprised. Every voyage brought back new information like plants that didn't exist in Chinese botanical texts, animals that didn't fit existing classifications, and political systems organized around different principles. That information was uncomfortable because it challenged the assumption that Chinese civilization had already solved all the important problems. That discomfort was precisely the point. Organizations that can tolerate discomfort stay adaptive. They maintain peripheral vision. They keep people around whose job is to imagine alternatives rather than optimize incumbents. The Ming court eliminated that discomfort, and in doing so, they eliminated their capacity to respond when the Manchus showed up with a better army and a more compelling vision. Under Sundar Pichai, Google has spent the last decade eliminating discomfort, ever since Larry Page and Sergey Brin retreated to Alphabet's holding company structure in 2015. The founders who could override the data, who could fund moonshots on intuition, who could tolerate the mess of genuine innovation, they're gone. Not from the org chart, but from the decision-making. What's left is a system optimized for predictability, streamlined and focused, ensuring that every team is aligned with the core strategic priorities. Those priorities, when you examine them honestly, all reduce to one thing: protect search and ads. When ChatGPT launched, Google's response wasn't to celebrate a new paradigm they could lead. It was code red because their monopoly was threatened. That framing tells you everything. An organization that sees innovation as a threat to be contained, rather than an opportunity to be seized, has already decided to build walls instead of ships. They just haven't admitted it yet. The specific technology doesn't matter. It could be AI today, or spatial computing tomorrow, or something we can't name yet. What matters is the institutional capacity to embrace the new rather than protect the old, and Google has systematically dismantled that capacity in favor of short-term predictability. The tragedy is that the Ming Dynasty had every advantage. They possessed the best technology, the most sophisticated bureaucracy, and the largest economy. They didn't lose those advantages to a superior competitor but abandoned them voluntarily because maintaining them had become organizationally inconvenient. Google has every advantage: the best talent, the most data, and the most sophisticated infrastructure. They're not losing those advantages to OpenAI or Anthropic or Microsoft or any specific competitor. They're abandoning them voluntarily because the organizational structure has made it easier to defend search than to build what comes next. In 1433, the Yongle Emperor's successors decided that stability was more important than possibility, that the risks of exploration outweighed the rewards, and that an empire should be measured by what it controlled rather than what it could create. 2 centuries later, their empire ended. Google is making the same choice, not in a single dramatic moment, because no one is burning the server farms, but in 1,000 small decisions that all point the same direction. Every reorg that disrupts institutional knowledge, Every moonshot that gets cancelled, every promotion that goes to someone who protected revenue rather than someone who challenged assumptions. Every transformer paper published and then handed to competitors to commercialize. Defensive consolidation, knowledge destruction, the coherence trap. These aren't separate problems, but all expressions of the same underlying failure, the belief that what you have is more valuable than what you could become. The Great Wall still stands. Tourists visit it every year. It's an impressive monument to an empire that decided defense was more important than discovery. In 100 years, people will study Google the same way we study the Ming. They'll marvel at the infrastructure. They'll analyze the strategy documents. They'll try to pinpoint the moment when the world's most powerful technology company decided that protecting its position was more important than earning it. And they'll find that moment everywhere. In every meeting where asking what this would do to search revenue killed a promising idea. In every strategy review where asking how this fits our core priorities eliminated the adjacent possible. In every hiring decision that selected for coherence over creativity. The Ming Dynasty and Google seem completely unrelated, but the underlying pattern connects perfectly. Empires don't fall to external enemies, they fall to internal decisions that prioritize control over capability. That's what we do here, finding the structural patterns that connect seemingly unrelated fields, because once you see the pattern, you can make different choices. Next week, we're looking at why Toyota's production system explains everything wrong with modern healthcare. Subscribe if you want to see it. And leave a comment below telling me the most obvious wall instead of ship decision you've ever watched a company make, the moment you knew they'd stopped exploring and started defending.